American welfare state has been one of the worst inventions ever envisioned by the politicians of this country. But one of the subsets of that same welfare state is perhaps more egregious than the entire idea itself, and that is the child welfare state. Because the child welfare state ostensibly, in appearance, presumes to protect the well-being of children and consequently their mothers by doing things that actually harm children and their mothers and the well-being of the entire family as a whole. And one of the best ways to assess how the child welfare state has actually harmed children, the family, and mothers is by looking at the disastrous record of the well-known cultural motif called child support. Now, I understand this topic is going to be rather controversial to some of you. I may have already elicited a few responses from those of you watching that may say, Christian, are you opposed to men or mothers, in most cases men, taking care of their children and having to step up and pay the bill? How could you want to critique child support? And if you have these ideas in your mind, I would ask that you put them to the back of your mind and just wait a few moments as I explain to you my case. It's not that I oppose men taking care of their children. In fact, men and women should take care of their children fully. Although right now we have a culture that deludes men and women into believing they're taking care of their children by sending their children to a government school for 7 to 8 hours a day and having their heads full of propaganda that ultimately harms the family, that ultimately harms their child's moral sense, and ultimately leads the child down to a bad path. Different story, different day. But in general, I absolutely believe that mothers and fathers take care of their children. But what I don't think is correct is when the government begins to manage that duty and direct it to its own ends. Before I actually get into why I think child support is so disastrous and why it has been so disastrous for the past few decades of American life, I must first explain to you the origins of child support, its intellectual and historical origins. Then I will explain to you my philosophical critique of why child support itself is bad, and I will explain the effects it has had that will then bolster that critique. So in order to actually identify the roots of child support, we're going to have to go outside of the continental boundaries of North America and go towards England. Indeed, my friends, it is often said that in the United Kingdom, in England, is where the historical basis of child support merges. In 1601, the Elizabethan Poor Laws, which were very prominent in England, were the earliest form of child support ever recorded. And the Poor Laws were unique in a few ways. They were unique compared to the modern system because the Poor Laws provided money to a mother and to a family that was racked by destitution. So your family had to be at absolute wit's end. It had to be at the bottom of the barrel before you could even qualify for child support in this historical sense. If you were divorced or separated, that did not give you the right to have child support. If you had a kid out of wedlock, which was almost unthinkable in those days, at least on a cultural level, it would be highly shamed, that did not qualify you for child support. So this form of child support actually kept the familial ties and bonds together by putting a minimum floor for the qualifications of receiving that support, and it emphasized the community coming together to help others in need. So whereas modern form days of child support actually destroy the familial bond and actually alienate the community, I'll explain in a second, this form actually kept everything together, and it was very specific and very limited in application. But then we go on throughout history, and there are certain statements in certain areas of history, in American history now, such as in 1858, with people saying, like Van Valkenburg saying that a parent is under a natural obligation to furnish necessaries for his infant child. And if the parent neglect that duty, any other person who have supplied such necessaries is deemed to have conferred a benefit on the delinquent parent, for which the law raises an implied promise to pay on part of the parent. So this is explaining the natural law obligation that every parent has to care for their child and the role society may very well play in ensuring that obligation is played out. This sentiment begins to build up and build up and build up, and it eventually culminates in 1896 to a point in American history where 11 states had made it a penal offense. They had made it illegal for a father to abandon or refuse to support his children. Then in 1898, now at this point, we're in the middle of the Progressive Era. And the Progressive Era is this era where ideas from Germany were imported into America and then pressed upon the American mind as moral necessities in order to save society from the binds of America's constitutional order. So in many ways, the Progressive Era was this anti-constitutional, anti-American movement that reformed America into the visions originally conceived by European aristocrats and bureaucrats embodied with the skin suit of Americanism. So this is when the entire idea of child support in welfare is being reworked to fit a certain ethos that is fundamentally anti-American. This will be important in a second. Just hold on. So in 1898, the federal government made attempts to encourage, and I'm quoting here, parental responsibility, presenting guidelines to enforce child support for absent parents. So there was now a sort of federalized standard for this. In 1910, the Uniform Desertion and Non-Support Act essentially made it a criminal action for fathers who deserted or willfully refused to support their children under 16. Now, this law was not particularly successful because prosecutors were worried that if fathers were penalized harshly by them, they would lose employment, and that would ultimately not only hurt them, but it would ultimately hurt the families as well. Then in 1910, this is when this culminates into something actionable. In 1912, rather, the Children's Bureau was established. Now, what was the Children's Bureau? The Children's Bureau was essentially the precursor to CPS, Child Protective Services. It was the precursor to Child Welfare Services. And it was created by a group of people called the maternalist reformers. Now, these maternalist reformers, these early feminists of the 20th century, they believed that society and the government had an obligation to care for the woman and her child, especially in the absence of the man. So the entire project of these women in the early 20th century was not to create a culture that instilled a sense of responsibility and conviction within the heart of the man to get him to go back towards his child and care for his family. It was to instead, in the absence of the man, fill that vacuum with support from the government and the collective, thereby almost permanently displacing the man. This is when things start to get bad. And this is why I think child welfare is one of the greatest deceptions in American history. Not because it fails at helping children, but because it was never intended to help a kid in the first place. Because if you're really going to help a child, you will want them to have as much of a compact family as possible, because statistically, having compact families that are healthy, all things being equal, not dysfunctional, but healthy, allow a child to grow into their human potential better than any other environment. I'm saying this as a kid myself, a single parent. I turned out okay, but I'm the outlier, generally. We understand what the general statistical norm is. But this welfarist mentality that came from the early 20th century feminists displaced the role of the father, and then built on that foundation an entire system of child welfare, which culminated in the Social Security Act of the 1930s, which then established formally the first kind of child support. And then, of course, child support became more federalized as that time goes on. By this time, it was already in a lot of states, as I mentioned before, in the 1890s. But it became more federalized. In the 1950s, there was a Amendments Act of the Social Security Act, and that legislation, and I quote, required state welfare agencies to notify appropriate law enforcement officials upon providing aid to families with dependent children to a child who was abandoned or deserted by a parent. And this federalization kept going on. In 1965, it was more federalized. In 1967, it was more federalized. And so the federalization of child support took the care of a child, and this is so devious, from a matter of local communities, which the states had more of an ear to, what was happening locally, to instead a matter of general federal bureaucracy. Now, even though I oppose child support and I oppose welfare in principle, if you're going to have a welfare program, the best way that you can ensure that welfare program will benefit the community, if you accept that it does, I don't, but if we accept that it does, is to ensure that welfare program is as close as possible to the people who need it the most. This federalization of child support that happened in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s ultimately as well, displaced that and put it in the hands of people in Washington, of these universalist bureaucrats who believe that their way was the best way for all of Americans. Now, I've explained to you a very brief history of this. We have to understand now what my critiques are and also what the effects of child support have been. The primary problem, one of the primary issues that I have with the idea of child support, is that it was motivated and established by necessity. What do I mean? Well, whenever a policy is established by urgency, whenever urgency justifies a program or a policy or a law, and that's now the foundation for the law, we have two things going on here. We have both a moral statement being made and we have a rhetorical statement being made. The rhetorical statement is actually a statement that moves people towards action. The moral statement won't move you towards action unless it is bound up with the emotionalism of the rhetorical statement. So, for example, the idea that we have to protect the children, which was the rallying call of the maternalist reformers whose programs eventually became the basis for child support in America. The idea that the children have to be protected, and if the father is destitute, then the government should be the natural person to help the children. That's a call for urgency, because most people in their heart of hearts want to help children. They want to help mothers who may be in bad situations. Charity is an integral part of the human spirit. And so the reformers, the progressives, took that spirit of charity that is bound up in our humanity and applied it to be the justification for a political program. But the problem is, when you are making justifications for political programs off the basis of urgency or off the basis of emotion, you cannot rationally and logically examine the merits of those political programs. That is the problem. When urgency becomes a political consideration and not simply an impulse that moves you towards action, urgency and emotion become the standard by which your politics operates. And a politics of emotion is 100% a politics of instability, a politics of chaos, and a politics of inconsistency that allows tyrants to advance programs that may very well be injurious to the moral principles a nation is founded on. Child support fits this bill because it quite literally usurped the familial bond by cementing the government within that context, which, by the way, the government's not supposed to be in the private context. It's only supposed to be in the public context. It's only supposed to make laws that are at a bare minimum protecting the family. But when the government gets in and starts to involve itself in the family and manage the family, that's when the family loses its strength, it loses its power, and it's no longer a matter of the family, it's now a matter of society. And families that are governed by society cannot govern themselves, therefore they're not truly families. And that's precisely what happened. And I'll demonstrate this in a second. Because people will say, well, he's just making a bunch of conjecture. No, I'm not. I'm making an argument from first principles. I'll explain in a moment the tangible impacts of this and how it's destroyed the familial bond. But you have to understand. See, here's the thing. So many of us want to look at statistics or spreadsheets. Few of us want to actually consider the first principles and the moral context around issues. But the moral context around issues will not only prevent you in the future, if you listen to it, from making similar errors that may be made in that context, but also it will inform you on what the right thing is to do. So it's very important to consider these things in totality. So when urgency and emotion motivate us, and our politics becomes a part of that, we become prey to emotional concepts dominating our politics. Let's take Mussolini, for example. This is a little bit off topic, but it kind of ties into itself. Mussolini began his entire Italian project, his authoritarian project in Italy, by appealing to the superstate that encompassed all life and represented Italian identity. Mussolini fundamentally believed that the government was not just a government. It was also the very center, the very foundation, the very binding cord of the nation, of the people in the nation, and the nation's very existence. It was a religious concept. And then the authoritarianism came afterwards. He was able to do this by appealing to the hearts, minds, and emotions of people. So if you're able to disable their ability to think rationally and think in terms of moral principles, and you instead have them think in terms of passions, you can justify almost anything and you can make it sound good. Now, the different thing about the earlier child support system that is not present in today's system is that in the Elizabethan era, both parents had to show desert and one had to show fault in order for one to be penalized to support the child. The system today, if a man has a child to a woman out of wedlock, he can be liable for the child even if the child is not his. There is no system of enforcing desert and fault, really. There is simply, well, there can be, but really there's not. In practice, there's not. And that has created a lot of tension that has bled into the issue and has made it such a palpable problem for so many men. There are men that have been paying for children or paid for children for 18 years that weren't actually theirs. And I find that entirely fascinating too. Because if you can't really have a connection to the child, why are you paying towards a child? Because under this system, this system of government rules, the normal considerations of the family life are not considered. What is instead considered is the utility, the benefit that supposedly the mother gets. Now, there's another flaw in child support laws that are very important, and it's the fact that judges, and this has actually been noted throughout history, judges in family court and family cases actually favor the woman over the man. And this is a well-known fact. And in a society that considers women to be the proper caretakers of the child, which has been a very dominant social norm for a while, and is willing to side with them in all familial disputes with state power, this creates a culture of resentment and broken families. And you know what it further does? It splits the sexes and puts them at war with each other. Now, let me play with this thought for a second. I told you that the maternalist reformers whose political program brought forth child support, they believed the government was supposed to ultimately be the caretaker of the woman and the child. This didn't just have an effect of creating the child welfare system. This had an effect in influencing the perceptions of feminists and women as history progressed into the notion that men and women were inherently opposed because, and this was the old feminist notion, the patriarchy is the nature of the family, and therefore, when the personal becomes political, as it did in the 60s, when this big federalism was going on, the woman now has a duty to get involved both politically and in the family and usurp the man's control. Well, when you have a system, you have a society that already by default believes that women are the natural caretakers, and they by default believe the man is going to be at fault if the child is abandoned or whatever, or if something happens where the man is no longer in the picture, you're going to have a society that is inherently biased against the man in that case. And child support has occurred in this context. Now, you may think I'm crazy, but the actual evidence of this is kind of hard. It's entirely hard to ignore. There was a comprehensive study done in 2013 called Child Support and Young Children's Development, because one of the entire justifications of child support is that it is necessary for a father to support his child in order to help them have a good life. Well, the study actually found an interesting thing that is not talked about very much. They divided child support into two categories: formal support and informal support. Now, formal support was support that was compelled by the state or federal government. That is what we know as child support today, where the father's wages are garnished or something like that happens, and he is forced to pay out money towards the mother, which is supposed to go to the child. That's another problem with child support, because there's no accountability for the money. The mother can use it however she wants to. I've seen this happen in my own, I won't go too far, but I've seen this happen in my own experiences, and there's no accountability for it no matter what, which is another problem. In the system, again, when you have a culture that automatically assumes benevolence to the woman, as opposed to holding both of the people in the family to a high standard, the father will be alienated no matter what happened, and he'll be called a deadbeat no matter what the actual facts of the case are. But back to this study. So the formal support's compelled. The informal support exists where the mother and the father are separate, but they are still in a union to care for the child. They set aside their differences, and they still are interested in the child's well-being. Well, there was actually a correlation found in this, not a correlation, a causal relationship found in this study between informal support and higher cognitive scores for the children's education, but formal support, the support compelled by the state, is actually linked with lower cognitive scores for the children. So when a child education is impacted by this, you would normally think that if the child support was effective, it would actually help children get more educated. But the exact opposite is true according to this study. Now, the study also went into this idea that when formal support happens, the father is not really involved in the home. In fact, the father is alienated from the home more often than not, and he's just sending a check to someone he has no idea he's even involved with. It's like a different universe for him. But when the informal support happens, what they found was the father is intimately involved in the child's life. And when the father is intimately involved in the child's life, the child tends to have better outcomes. I will read from the study itself. The study itself says, we found a positive association between informal support and cognitive scores, found that was explained by a father's non-financial involvement with the children. So again, it's all about how involved the father is with his child. So this is evident to me, this is empirical evidence to me, that child support, instead of helping the kid, actually drives the father and the family apart when it is formal, because it's the government going in and compelling them to do something. And in that circumstance, that is not conducive to familial unity. Familial unity requires on both parts of the parents a desire to want to engage and help with the kid in their development. And there are families right now that have two parents that are involved, that are not divorced, who are still rather indifferent to their child's lives. They may see them as simply a mouth to feed, nothing more. So that leads to bad outcomes too, by the way. But when you have a healthy, normal situation where both parents are working together, whether they're divorced or not, that leads to better outcomes for the child. When the government comes in and tries to supplement the role of the man by penalizing the man, regardless of the situation or anything like that, we see a negative impact. Child support's greatest evil is in destroying the familial bond by penalizing the family and trying to manage and rearrange family relationships, so much so that it destroys the natural tie parents, particularly fathers in this case, should have with their children. This evidence shows that 110%. Paternal duty or maternal duty can only be undertaken if it is undertaken by a move of the heart. If it is undertaken by force, that will then cause a bunch of different emotions to come in between the father and the kid. And also, we should probably understand that if it's formal support and the father has no interest in being there, or the mother is at enmity with the father and she's fighting with him and she's villainizing the child, which happens all the time as well, then that's also going to have a bad impact. No amount of money is going to be able to replace the damage that does to that child's life. Child welfare has actually been a conduit for some of the greatest instances of child harm we've seen. Now, progressives will oftentimes critique the child support system, not by appealing to philosophy, not by appealing to first principles, not by doing anything like that. They will almost always critique the system by appealing to the impacts that child support has on poor minority men. They will almost always say, well, poor minority men are penalized by this, they can get incarcerated for not paying, therefore it's bad. But this is a very deceptive argument, because it's an argument of enforcement, not an argument of substance. So for example, I mentioned that the Elizabethan laws actually required the family to show they deserve the child support, and to show a circumstance in which the child support would actually be implemented, rather than simply being able to have it or have it given to them through some loose system of rules that don't really verify very much of anything and leaves it open to abuse. Now, and the fact that child support laws almost unilaterally favor women, that's a problem of substance. The fact that child support laws come in between the father and the family, that's a problem of substance. The fact that child support laws constitute an attempt to manage the family from on high, these are problems of substance. What progressives do is they oftentimes argue within this hermetically sealed premise where they assume that something is good because it fits their own presuppositions about what is good, but they will never actually investigate their own premises and ask themselves, is this belief or conviction that I have and support, is it actually morally sound? Is it actually logically sound? And most people who critique child support will critique it on the basis of how it is enforced, not on the basis of what it is essentially as a thing. That is a big philosophical problem that we all have to get to the bottom towards. So in closing, my friends, I ultimately think the best thing we can do to ensure an enduring culture where the child is supported in a genuine way, and not simply in a way that appeases the do-gooders in society, not simply a way that unilaterally favors one sex over the other, but in a way that strengthens the familial bonds and ties, and also aids in the human flourishing of the child, is by cultivating a culture where fatherlessness and absentee fatherhood is not a good thing. It's not celebrated. It's not talked about in rap songs. It's not some kind of thing to be craved, and instead a vice to be avoided. And by doing that, you ultimately get the same effect of child support without having the state apparatus come in with all this philosophical, erroneous, apparatus, legalistic apparatus, and ruin it for everybody. That is the way that we actually ensure things. Far too many people want to appeal to some force beyond them to fix the problems in their life without realizing that the problems are much more local and much closer than they actually seem. If we can fix this problem, then perhaps this ugly picture that unfortunately is the reality for so many people in America and so many children in America, that has been the death knell of so many families, that has ripped apart fathers from their kids. Hopefully, we can permanently reverse this and get towards a healthier, more unified American family in the future. That is my wish. Perhaps I'm too optimistic, but I believe we can do it if we begin to rework our expectations of the system, what the system should be doing, versus what it is doing right now. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can to make sure this channel can be as successful as possible. If you want to help me continue to get my message out there, be sure to donate to me if you want to, if you can. No pressure, of course. It's all in the comment section down below. Also, be sure to share the video if you can as well. And be sure also to comment and tell me what you think as well. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.